Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. How are all of you feeling this fine Sunday afternoon? Awesome. I'm so excited to see all of you. Thank you so much for coming out on this rainy Charleston afternoon. Welcome to the first lecture of the 2025 Little Lectures series. In the 5 years that I've been here as the council's program officer, if you don't know me yet, my name is Kyle Warmack, but I think I know probably 3/4 of you in the room at this point. But I've come to know that the March Little Lecture is where we see the stalwarts, the real fans, the diehards of the series. So even though it's the first one of the year and the staff still needs to shake a little bit of the rust off, I've come to appreciate getting to see all of you in particular here. But those who attended last year's lectures, which were many of you seating here today, you know that they were from top to bottom pretty serious in our subject matter. We examined the roots of conflict with topics like the war in Gaza through the historical lens of the American military experience in the Middle East, the global history of concentration camps, and the legal mechanisms by which Manifest Destiny's colonial proponents deprive Native American peoples of their land. Heavy stuff. So this year's series is considerably lighter. Though, let's face it, literature is no less a serious topic, or you all wouldn't be here today. So we hope you'll go on a journey with us into some of the best in contemporary West Virginia writing with novelist Glenn Taylor, author of The Ballad of Trenchmouth Taggart and several other novels, Marrowbone Marble Company, a lot of great ones, on April 27th, and poet and musician Doug Van Gundy on June 22nd. We have a fresh announcement from a couple of days ago that novelist Misha Marin, who is the May Little Lecture, needs to reschedule, so we will be putting her in July 20th. So we'll be getting announcements out about that soon, as well as some announcements about what we're going to do in May instead of Misha Marin. So keep your eyes and ears peeled for that. So on to today's speaker and topic, whom most of you know quite well, since he's usually in the building here. There's lots of precedent for the executive director giving the occasional little lecture on a topic in his wheelhouse, and there are few better qualified to set the stage for this year's literary-minded series than Eric. So without further ado, let me set the stage for him. American literature began as regional writing. Throughout a complex history spanning over 400 years, American imaginative writing has never lost its attentiveness to local landscapes, conditions, and perspectives. In his lecture today, Dr. Waggoner will discuss American literature's regionalist beginnings, the unique emergence of West Virginia literature in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and our present cultural moment when the literature of the Mountain State is more attuned than ever to national and global concerns. Eric Waggoner became the executive director of the West Virginia Humanities Council in 2018 after many years of teaching in the English department at West Virginia Wesleyan College. He holds a PhD in English from Arizona State University. His scholarly essays have appeared in journals including Hemingway Review, the Journal of Autobiographical Studies, Appalachian Journal, and books including American Literature in Transition, 1970 to 1980 from Cambridge University Press, and Western Subjects, Autobiographical Writing in the North American West, University of Utah Press. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Eric Waggoner.
I'm the director. They couldn't stop me. That was the whole thing. Right. Thank you guys for showing up. It is wonderful to see you all here today. Thanks for coming out to talk about what I think is really, really exciting work being done in West Virginia imaginative writing. I've been saying for years, this is a really interesting time to be in West Virginia and to be a West Virginian. I think that is nowhere more true than in the arts. And I'm going to make the case today that it's particularly true in West Virginia literature. So the general topic today is American regionalism and realism in West Virginia literature in 2025. I want to talk a little bit about how we, as an escaped academic, how we taught West Virginia literature, how it's different today than when I was teaching it and discussing it kind of for a living. And talk about I'm going to mention about 24 names probably in the course of today's lecture, but for every one that I mention, there's 8 or 10 that I'm not. I mean, there is so much fantastic work going on in the field today. So thank you all for coming out. And I hope you'll be able to come back out to hear some of the actual writers, some of the actual poets and fiction writers who are working in the field. I'm a nonfiction writer. I kind of snuck in there on the side. What do we talk about when we talk about regionalism? Regionalism as a literary movement, capital R, regionalism, the time period that refers to is immediately after the Civil War. There were many writers in that period who began to, for a variety of reasons, document unique cultural qualities of particular areas, in the United States. But the reasons for that development kind of bridge the pre and post-war years. And there were a few primary movements that come into play here. First of all, accelerated industrialization and urban development and rural outflow. That is, people moving from rural areas into the cities. When that happens in the years immediately preceding and after the Civil War, the cities become a major site of population growth, and the cities become major sites of cultural production. There was still a lot of work going on in the rural areas and the outlying areas, but the process of industrialization and indeed the business of publishing became more centralized in the urban areas. In the years immediately following the Civil War, what had been a very decentralized publication model, a lot of areas had their own printing presses and printing houses. The business of publishing becomes localized primarily in New York, overwhelmingly in New York, but there were also secondary markets in Boston and Philadelphia. So if you didn't live near those centers, or you weren't a writer who had access to those centers, it became a little more difficult to get your work published unless you were going to go the self-publication route. Book and magazine publications, however, grew in this period by as much as 800%. It was really a phenomenal boom in serial publication and book publication during this 30-year period here between 1820 and 1850. And another element that occurs during this period, which a lot of people don't think about, but is equally as important, is developments in transportation. It was a lot easier to get your books and your magazines shipped to various parts of the country. There's an argument to be made that between 1820 and 1850, the United States was one of the most aggressively literate and literary cultures in the world for just these reasons. There was so much being produced. But in the years following the Civil War, when a lot of culture was about reunification and about the American character and about how America moves forward from this, there was, as there often is, a kind of a balanced development of a sense of identity that was rooted in place. Local conditions, neighborhoods, towns, the American South, the American Northeast. What makes New England different from the deep American South? You had a lot of writers who were really grappling with these kinds of concerns. The reunification, in other words, the sort of national reunification, was balanced by an increased sense of place. But regional writing, not the regionalist movement, now we're going to go back here a little bit, not just the regionalist literary movement, but regional writing in America in particular predates all of what I'm talking about. In fact, from its beginnings, what we think of today as American literature has always engaged in regional writing to some degree or another. And this happens as early as the contact period. The earliest European writing from the so-called New World is really kind of fixed in its uses, because if you're trying to get the King of Spain to pay for more journeys back and forth, you got to really sell the place, right? So what happens in the earliest European writing dispatched from the New World is, and you see this over and over again, you see a blend of descriptive content, what is here, what kinds of people are here, what does this place look like, what is the landscape, this really, really deep detail about space and place. And also, it has to be said, utilitarian content. What can this place be used for? What grows here? What can we get out of it? The return on investment basically is what this is. If you're sending back dispatches, if you're Bernal Diaz or Christopher Columbus, communicating back with heads of state in Europe, what you're trying to do is say, this is a good investment. This is something we need to keep up. So this combination of descriptive and utilitarian content is really kind of paramount throughout it. But interestingly, for reasons that I'm sure are obvious to you, there's also a lot of religious metaphor laid over this, because we're not just doing this on behalf of the crown, we're doing this on behalf of Christian culture. So there's a lot of religious metaphor. You see that kind of interwoven with the descriptive content. It has this kind of religious or faith-based underpinning. And also, even in cases where there is an overt religious metaphor, you get a lot of what we might call the affective impact or the emotional impact of the landscape. What does it feel like to stand here and to be around all of this? So in this context, regional writing, with the small r, regional writing, represents in a lot of ways an impulse to what we might call interpretive description. You're describing the place and you're describing the people, but you're reading it through a very particular kind of lens. What does this place mean? What are the emotional impacts? What are the imaginative effects that are stirred by this place? Reading place, in other words, through an imaginative filter that invests place with meaning. So in the time-honored academic tradition, I'm going to cheat and go away from my notes here and go way, way back. William Bradford of Plymouth Plantation, this is an early Puritan writer. This is a very famous passage from a book called Of Plymouth Plantation, which is Bradford's history of that the arrival at Plymouth. and the setting up of the first Puritan communities in the New World. This book was based on Bradford's journal, and so the writing of it spans about 21 years. It wasn't a book that he sat down all at once to write. He sort of assembled it over a couple of decades, and it was lost for a long time, rediscovered in the 19th century. Really interesting book. This is a passage when the Puritans have just, in Bradford's telling, they have just gotten down off the boat. They've just come down off the Mayflower, and they're surveying the landscape. Here I cannot but stay and make a pause and stand half amazed at this poor people's present condition. And so will I think will the reader too, when he well considers the same. Being thus past the vast ocean and a sea of troubles, see what he did? Nice metaphor. Before in their preparation, they had now no friends to welcome them, nor inns to entertain or refresh their weather-beaten bodies, no houses or much less towns to repair to. Besides, what could they see but a hideous and desolate wilderness, full of wild beasts and wild men, and what multitudes there might be of them they knew not. Neither could they, as it were, go up to the top of Pisgah to view from this wilderness a more goodly country to feed their hopes. Pisgah, if you know your Old Testament, that's the point from which Moses stood and surveyed the promised land. For whichsoever way they turn their eyes, save upward to the heavens, they could have little solace or content in respect of any outward objects. For summer being done, all things stand upon them with a weather-beaten face, and the whole country, full of woods and thickets, represented a wild and savage hue. Bradford always rewards reading aloud. There's a lot to talk about here. But you notice, it's the wilderness. It's the full of woods and the thickets, the wild and savage space, the wild and savage people. Embedded in the description of place is that threat. Look what we've just come over, and there's no way to go back now, right? Here we are. We've got to build it. We've got to make from this space something that is habitable and livable. Interestingly, as Bradford, comes early in the book, as Bradford goes along, and he begins to narrate, his story of the first Thanksgiving and of conflicts and later treaties with the Indians and so forth, Native Americans, the indigenous peoples. This space begins to resemble paradise. We've created something really wonderful out of this. And then toward the end of the book, Bradford, from an advanced age now, looks back and says, the young people don't know how tough we had it. And you realize kids today is not a new innovation. By the time he gets to the end of the book, you don't know what it was like when we first got here. But it's really, this interesting, all the metaphors here, the sea of troubles, the thicket, the wilderness, the wildness. There is all of that description of place, but it's in the service of a very specific kind of interpretation. Let's jump ahead now, okay? Thomas Jefferson. I'm cheating because although Thomas Jefferson is standing on what's currently the border between West Virginia and Virginia, he's facing the opposite direction. He's looking back east. But this is a passage that comes from Notes on the State of Virginia, and it's sort of the present day, it's the Potomac Highlands. The passage of the Potomac through the Blue Ridge is perhaps one of the most stupendous scenes in nature. You stand on a very high point of land. Notice again, we're on this vantage point, this high vantage point, surveying everything. On your right comes up the Shenandoah, having ranged along the foot of the mountains 100 miles to seek a vent. On your left approaches the Potomac, in quest of a passage also. In the moment of their junction, they rush together against the mountain, rend it asunder, and pass it off to the sea. It is as placid and delightful as it is wild and tremendous. For the mountain being cloven asunder, she presents to your eye, through the cleft, a small catch of blue horizon, at an infinite distance in the plain country, inviting you, as it were, from the riot and tumult roaring around, to pass through the breach and participate of the calm below. This is a very deeply Enlightenment idea, and it's a very Jeffersonian idea. Out of chaos comes that placidness, comes that order, right? We face a threat, we face chaos, we face violence, metaphorical and literal. But with the right set of eyes and with the right perspective, we can make it into something calm, right? And notice here too, although there is not the religious undertone that we saw in Bradford, there is that wildness and there is that peacefulness that emerges from it. So back to regionalism with the capital R as a literary movement. How does it develop? Well, it goes like so. It takes about 2 or 3 generations from 1776 to create what we might think of as a distinctively American literature. So if you look at the sort of, American literature doesn't really break down neatly into time periods, and these are just sort of ways of understanding anyway, but you can make some pretty distinctive differentiations between these. The early national period runs from the post-Revolutionary War to about the 1820s. This is the period where you get Washington Irving, the Headless Horseman, right? Legend of Sleepy Hollow. You get James Fenimore Cooper, right? Last of the Mohicans, and some of this type of writing. Edgar Allan Poe also begins writing here. The argument can be made, what we have in these writers, because they haven't had enough of an American history to really talk about American culture. What you have primarily are European literary forms that are being written in the United States, in the young United States. So somebody like Washington Irving, even somebody like James Fenimore Cooper, who wrote a lot about the frontier, you could transplant Fenimore Cooper and Washington Irving to any other location, and much of the content would be the same. Even though Irving is writing about the Hudson River Valley, he's writing about legends in the Dutch tradition that are centuries and centuries old. So what you have are European styles and forms kind of transplanted to a new space. American landscape is a kind of character in and of itself. Washington Irving, as I said, writes a lot about the Hudson River Valley. Fenimore Cooper writes about what would have then been the frontier, kind of in the Ohio-ish area. But you've got a lot of discussion, or excuse me, a lot of literary styles that were pretty well established in European imaginative writing. The American Renaissance, what's called the American Renaissance, which begins more or less in the 1820s and continues through the Civil War, this is what I think of as a really, really interesting period in American writing. This is where you get Herman Melville, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Margaret Fuller, some of these names that you may be familiar with. You've got enough history now, after the founding of the American nation, that American writers have an American history to draw from, and they have an American culture to talk back to. So somebody like Nathaniel Hawthorne, for example. One of Nathaniel Hawthorne's direct ancestors was a judge at the Salem witch trials in Massachusetts. So when Nathaniel Hawthorne writes The Scarlet Letter, when he writes Young Goodman Brown, some of these stories that grapple with the Puritan history, what he's doing is he's writing literature that kind of reimagines something very specific and very unique to American history and culture, and asking, what does it say about us as a culture, as a society? What does this history say about our American heritage? Herman Melville, Moby Dick, is a book about a whale, of course, but it's also about race, it's also about economics, it's also about work, it's also about American industry. I mean, that book is about virtually everything that you can imagine. And it's a book that could not have been written in England. It's a book that does not draw, it is aware of its European kind of history and literary forebears. But that is a distinctively American book, as The Scarlet Letter is a distinctively American book. As American slave narratives, which also developed during this period, are distinctively American types of writing. This is the period in which the literature that America produces is endemic to the culture that produced it. And so you have American literature, I hope this makes sense, looking back through American history and culture for its primary dramatic and thematic elements. In other words, it can write not just about what happened here, but about what all that happening means. And the realist period, which begins roundabout in the years immediately following the Civil War and lasts through the early 20th century, this is where you get American regionalism. This is where writers began to look, a lot of writers began to look very closely at the conditions in their home communities and write about those. So regionalism, like realism, focuses on regional or community conditions, not only as dramatic settings, that is to say, where the story takes place, but as dramatic drivers. There's something about the story that is very particular to this space. The space in which we live have primary impacts on our lived experiences. So what you find in realist writing and regionalist writing is it's very attentive to speech patterns, the way people talk. It's very attentive to clothing, food, work, and conditions of work, social customs, and other daily elements of individual lives and community culture. All literature does this. All literature takes place in a space, right? But regionalist writing really looks closely at the conditions that obtain here and talk about what it means to live under and in those conditions. Making sense so far? Okay. Still in all, though, you can write about place in a way that's very reductive and very simplistic. This is what we often think of as local color, right? You throw in a couple of accents, you throw in a couple of slang terms, you write about one or two local, landmarks or whatever it is, and you've got it. Regionalist writing goes a lot deeper than that. Good regionalist writing goes a lot deeper than that. One of my favorite things ever said about this is Jane Ann Phillips, and I have to drop a name and say she actually said this to me. I was interviewing her once, and I just thought it was a great phrase. I haven't forgotten it. Good writing about place isn't regionalism, because it isn't just looking at this place, it's looking at the world through this place. And that's something that I think is really, really interesting when it comes time to talk about contemporary West Virginia writers in particular. So, following statehood in 1863, West Virginia writers, if you think about it, were kind of in a similar position to early American writers. the imaginative space in which their writing was located had just undergone really violent changes. And we were the only state to be born out of conflict, out of the Civil War. So that violence was both real violence and it was also conceptual violence. We needed a new state constitution. We needed to draw borders. There was a whole system of government that had to be set up. And those changes fundamentally altered the character of the landscape and kind of reset its starting point. It's not that nobody here was writing before. It's that the context in which that imaginative writing is taking place now is very different. And so it took West Virginia writers, I would argue, it took West Virginia writers about a generation to begin depicting West Virginia as a space with its own unique geopolitical character, its own social conditions and cultural history, and its own relationship to national literature. Here are a few of the earliest American writers. I should put in a plug here and say that at EWV, the West Virginia Encyclopedia, you can read about all these writers and more. Anne Spencer. Now this is interesting too, because when we call somebody a West Virginia writer, what does that mean, right? This is the kind of conversations that academics can have for decades at a time. Does it mean you were born here? Man, kind of. Does it mean you lived here? Maybe, sure. You have some ties and connections. Probably you lived here at some point. Do you have to live here to be a West Virginia writer? That's arguable. Pearl Buck was here for 4 months, and we haven't stopped talking about her yet. So we have what we find is some really interesting kind of elements of variation in the way in which we describe people as West Virginia writers, or indeed writers of any region or any state. It's a very sort of basic kind of conversation to have about writers and origins. But some folks that I think are particularly interesting in this period are Anne Spencer, poet, really wonderful black poet, who's active in the Harlem Renaissance and spent a lot of her childhood in Bramwell, of all places, West Virginia. She was born in Virginia, but she stayed due to some family situations, she stayed with foster parents in Bramwell for a set of years and was active in the Harlem Renaissance. She had a long life and a long career. She wrote right up until her death in 1975. She is not often thought of as a West Virginia writer, but she was here. She wrote poetry. She contributed that poetry she was part of one of the major Black American literary movements and art movements in history. Would you call any of these writers who lived here for some period of time West Virginia writers? That's an arguable proposition, but I think these are important things to know. Melville Davidson Post, if any of you were familiar with the first season of our podcast, Mysterious Mountains, we featured a lot of short stories by Melville Davidson Post of Harrison County in and around Clarksburg. He was the author of the Uncle Abner detective stories. Rebecca Harding Davis, this is probably a name that if you know American literature at all, you're familiar with. She spent about half her life in Wheeling, and she wrote what's commonly considered one of the great classics of social realism in the short story Life in the Iron Mills. John Peel Bishop, a poet, essayist, and short story writer whose story collection, I'm sorry to say, Many Thousands Gone, is set in a fictionalized Charlestown where he was born. That's where his home was. He was also a classmate of F. Scott Fitzgerald, of all things, and he appears as a character, not under this name, of course, but he's the basis for a character in Fitzgerald's novel, This Side of Paradise. A lot of people don't know this stuff. It's a really, really interesting period of time for all of these writers, too, because you notice all the birth dates here, their lives kind of span years that we're talking about here. So immediately in Rebecca Harding Davis's case, prior to the Civil War, but in Melville Davidson Post's case, born immediately afterward, Spencer and Bishop come along a little bit later, but they're part of that first generation. I mean, that where the boundaries and the borders have changed. So in this period, like in early American literature, you don't get a lot of writers writing about specifically West Virginia landscapes, West Virginia history, West Virginia topics, because that history hasn't come yet. That all changes in 1950 or so. Around the middle period of the 20th century, this span between 1950 and 2000 is where West Virginia literature really not only comes into its own, but emerges on a national stage. When I was teaching West Virginia literature, these were the four that you had to have in the room. You could have other writers, but if you were going to teach West Virginia literature, you had to read something or other by all four of these. Davis Grubb of Moundsville in the Ohio River Valley, author of Night of the Hunter, which has never gone out of print as far as I know, was made into a classic film that I'm sure most of you in the room have seen, but also wrote 10 or a dozen additional books, and went back a lot to his West Virginia childhood and to Moundsville and to the Ohio River Valley to write a lot. He worked on multiple genres. There was a lot of supernatural and mystery stories that he wrote. There were straight short stories and fiction. There is an aggressively strange book called Ancient Lights, that was his final novel, which is long overdue for reappreciation. That is a deeply weird book. It's his entry into kind of experimental fiction. But Davis Grubb had a long, long career. Jane Ann Phillips, recent Pulitzer winner for Night Watch. Jane Ann Phillips is from Buchanan and has several books, including the ones that are probably the most widely known. Black Tickets is her earliest collection of short fiction. Machine Dreams, her first novel, which was really, really famous. It blew up big when it came out. And Jane Ann, I would say, probably as much as anybody else, put contemporary West Virginia literature on the map with that novel, Machine Dreams, which is about West Virginia, but it also takes place in and around Korea and Vietnam, too. Maybe you're familiar with that book. It's about a family who served in military, not only in military context, but in actual combat over a series of generations. And Night Watch, as I said, that's the one that is brought to the Pulitzer. Breeze Pancake, who sadly only had one collection before he committed suicide, or the collection came out after he committed suicide. Pancake remains, I think, a huge touchstone for West Virginia writers. Like I said, I'm a nonfiction writer. I'm not a poet. I'm not a fiction writer. But I remember very clearly when I was a kid picking up a copy of Breeze Pancake's stories in the library. And there's a short story called Time and Again, which is a very, very dark short story, if you know that one. And it's about the narrator of the book drives a snowplow along that 8-mile stretch on Route 60 between Gawley and Anstead. And I grew up on Route 60, and that's a stretch that I know really well. And he talks about Hawk's Nest, and he talks about Chimney Corners and all those little towns throughout. And I remember reading that story and thinking, I didn't know you could do that. I didn't know you could write literature about the place that you knew. I thought literature was something that happened in the South with Faulkner, or something that happened in the West, you know what I mean? Or in New England, New York writers, California writers. I thought these were the places where literature happened and where art happened. And for me, like a lot of writers, it was Breeze Pancake. I remember that shock very vividly. I think it's Toni Morrison said, all writers need somebody to give them permission. And it's the person you find when you first start reading and you have that reaction. I didn't know I was allowed to talk about that. I didn't know that the place where I came from and the experience I had was suitable for literature. Pancake still looms very large. Denise Giardina, who's still writing, still working, still with us. She lives actually in town, lives here in Charleston. Has her novels are kind of a blend of the novels that are set in West Virginia, The Storming Heaven and Unquiet Earth, and also works of European historical fiction. And Denise, as much as anybody else, I think, has, throughout her career of writing, has been able to plug West Virginia in with these sort of broader national and indeed international concerns. What happens here isn't just about what happens here, but it has its tracings in other times and other spaces. Speaking of, Mary Lee Settle, Buell Quintet. Mary Lee Settle is not, I don't think she's very widely read today, and it's a real shame. Her books are in print. The Buell Quintet is still in print. But the Buell Quintet is a series of 5 novels published over the course of a little bit of 26 years that trace the development of families and people from 17th century England to contemporary West Virginia. It's a fictionalized Charleston. The town's called Canona. But in this series of 5 novels, she spans everything from the 1600s up into contemporary with Killing Ground in 1982, contemporary life in West Virginia. There are no characters common to the books because they take place in very different time periods, but they're related. They're descendants and their forebears and so forth. And so all of these, we get the chance to see all of these people that no set of people in any individual novel knew, but we know them because of these kind of generational ties. There is still nothing like the Buell Quintet in West Virginia writing. I mean, it really is a towering achievement. It is a century-spanning story of the area's history and development, and is likely to remain the kind of unique entry that it is for some years to come. Let's talk a little about poetry. West Virginia in its history has had 7 poets laureate. The poet laureate position, it's a governmental appointment, but it isn't a political appointment. Nobody would give any poet any political power. It's a governmental appointment. And the three most recent, Mark Harshman, who's current poet laureate, Irene McKinney, who was poet laureate before Mark, and Louise McNeil, who preceded Irene. Not all of their books are in print currently, but they all have books that are currently in print, if that makes sense. Not the entirety of Louise McNeil's work, but there are a number of reprints of hers and Irene's that are still available. The West Virginia position has historically been a gubernatorial appointment for renewable 2-year terms, but you see, once you get in, you're kind of in there for a while, right? And that's a good thing. It's part of the role of the poet laureate is to express through poetry, through that art, the reality and the lived experience of what it means to be here. And often in West Virginia's case, I would say, the poets who have been chosen for that position are poets who have a long-standing list of credits to that effect. I mean, Louise, none of them needed to become poet laureate to write about West Virginia. They all wrote very well about West Virginia, and Mark continues to do so. So we've got this really, really vibrant culture here. Now, once again, for every name that I'm telling you, I'm leaving out 8 or 10 others. But when I was teaching West Virginia literature, this landscape was how it was. The 4 on the preceding slide and these 3 here, these were the ones that you had to talk about. And it was that way for many years. Now, something happens in about the year 2000, and I don't know why. I have some theories on it, but there has been an explosion of West Virginia literature in the last 25 years. I could stand up here and list the names all day. And we were talking a little bit before the lecture today. I think one of the reasons for this expansion and explosion of literature is that now West Virginia writers have this real deep tradition of very interesting literary work to draw from. So if you're a short story writer, you know Breeze Pancake. If you're a novelist, you know Davis Grubb, you know Jane Ann Phillips. And a lot of those stories up to that time period have been told. But Appalachia in the 21st century is not what Appalachia was in the years leading up to it. And the same is true of West Virginia writers. So what has changed? Well, I said one of the things that happened with regionalist writing and realism was that you had these centers of publication, but writers began looking kind of closer by to see. A lot of writers began looking at conditions in their home communities and chose that to write about. What was the reality of living in this space that not many people saw? And a lot of West Virginia writers up to this point have done so. But West Virginia writers in the year 2000 and beyond we all have our phones in our pockets. We are much more connected to the wider world than we used to be. Coal, although it is still a primary industry in West Virginia, is not what it was. Walmart is currently a bigger employer in West Virginia than the coal companies are. Just if you look at the percentages. So what's the true reality? What is the reality like for West Virginia writers who are writing in this period? One of the first things we recognize is that the group of West Virginia writers who are really solid and doing good work now are incredibly diverse. There has never been as diverse a group of West Virginia writers in terms of ethnicity, background, types of lived experience, where they come from, some from the population centers, some from rural areas, some who are academically trained, others who are not academically trained and chose to go another route, but who have just kind of built it up on their own. And I think they all begin with an assumption of West Virginia's interconnectedness, not its isolation, but its interconnectedness. I kept going back to that question of what does it mean? What is it like to be here? What does it mean to be from here? Okay. And that interconnectedness of West Virginia with the nation and the wider world, I think younger West Virginia writers take that as a fundamental assumption. It used to be that it was tough to get around this place because the roads before the interstates, before the New River Gorge Bridge, it took a while to get from one place to another. It's not that way anymore. It used to be that it was tough to get news. Not that way anymore. It used to be that it was difficult to leave and come back. Not that way anymore. So you have a whole crop of young West Virginia writers who are writing about a very different kind of lived experience. And to my mind, as I said, I think they're the most diverse, productive, and internationally recognized. They constitute that most robust period of West Virginia creative writing across all genres, fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. So what does it mean to be from here? What does it mean to be here? What does being from here mean when you go out into the wider world? Well, I said these younger writers don't think of West Virginia as being isolated. They don't think of themselves as being isolated. But it is true, and we all recognize, there are certain kinds of stereotypes about West Virginia that when you get outside the boundaries, you encounter and you run into. When I was at Arizona State, I was embarking on my PhD. I'd gotten my master's. I'd gone out to Arizona State to get my PhD. And one of the first weeks that I was there, I was sitting around a table with a bunch of folks. We'd all gone out to the bar or whatever it is. We were all doing it. What's your name? Where you come from? So forth. And I was sitting there, and I remember this very vividly. A lady across the table from me who I did not know, had just met her that evening. We were going around, where'd you come from? I said, I'm from West Virginia. And she said, oh, you should be very proud you're from West Virginia and you can read. And I said a very bad word. But it's that kind of, that sort, you have that notion of being this, first of all, if you're young and you leave West Virginia and go somewhere else, you're kind of an odd bird. How'd you get here? Where'd you come? Well, on a plane, like you, dummy. How I got, So those sort of assumptions we know we still have to fight about. And we also know there are some kinds of stereotypes. The two main ones I think that people are familiar with are the idea of Appalachia in general and West Virginia in particular as being one of two things, either defined by sorrow, suffering, hardship, drug abuse, rampant, poverty, most of this one side. And then there's the paradise. There's almost heaven. It's kind of like the Mayberry, the old Andy Griffith show, right? Where people are just folks and kind to each other. Well, we know there's a universe of possibility between those two extremes. And the current crop of West Virginia writers, I think, understand that and use it to their advantage. They understand that some of these, there is poverty, there is struggle, there are challenges. The choice to stay here, as anybody knows, it's a rough one. You have some things to fight against and to work with when you're here. But we also know, and I certainly would make this argument, that a lot of what West Virginia culture is defined by is helpfulness and people helping each other get through. I think there's a very, very deep, there's something about that element of character that I think of, I'm sure it's everywhere, but I think of it as being very, very endemic to West Virginia. If you help a West Virginian change a tire, you're going to get a Christmas card every year for the rest of your life. I think this is true. So both of these things can be true. And it's not either or, it's both and. And what is really cool about the young West Virginia writers, I think, is how attuned they are to that both and. So here are a couple of other thoughts here. There's another one from Jane Ann. This is from a Publishers Weekly interview, I think. For me, West Virginia is composed of magical, retentive, pressured elements. The weight of the mountainous, isolated, exploited landscape, and the depth and complexity of a culture that's largely misunderstood and stereotyped. Having one's origins in a no man's land, a deeply specific isolation drenched in family stories and secrets, is a huge advantage for a writer. And I think that's still true. I think you'd find a lot of young West Virginia writers still agreeing with that. How many, it doesn't take too far to go into your own families before you find a good storyteller, before you find a musician, before you find somebody who can, work that vein, okay, come here in the kitchen and help me make dinner for everybody and let me tell you about your uncle, that son of a, we know these kinds of things happen. That element of storytelling and that element of secrecy really is, I think, a rich, I agree, I think it's a rich vein for a writer. And here's another one of my favorites from Irene McKinney. I'm a hillbilly, a woman, and a poet, and I understood early on that nobody was going to listen to anything I had to say anyway, so I might as well just say what I want to. And there's another deeply West Virginia attitude for you, right? You don't have to like it, but I'm going to get to the end of this sentence. All right. Again, he said, beating a dead horse. For every name I'm telling you, I'm leaving a bunch out. But of the current crop of West Virginia writers, I think these are some of the most interesting. We have up here John Corcoran in the top left corner. John, a short story writer and nonfiction writer, from in and around Elkins, Randolph County, whose book No Son of Mine is all about his coming out as a gay man and the relationship that he had with his mother and the kind of pressures that they went back and forth with. Torley Bush, just below John, really, really wonderful Black West Virginia writer. Webster Springs, I believe, that's where he's from. And he has written also nonfiction, but his first collection of poetry is just out. Really fantastic stuff. Misha Marin here in fiction. Misha Marin and Glenn Taylor, both of whom are going to be with us later on in this series, also doing really wonderful work in long form and short form fiction. The gentleman down here with the bandage over his eye is Scott McClanahan. Really, really wild guy. Of all the writers in West Virginia, and in some ways, to me, he's the most interesting. He is a guy with, I think he would agree, not much of a filter, and really, really interesting fiction. I come from down around living down around the Beckley area now, I think. In poetry here, we have Randy Ward, Doug Van Gundy, who is also going to be with us this year, and Crystal Good, who is, in addition to being a poet, has over the last couple of years undertaken the publication of a newspaper, Black by God. You notice how when I'm saying, okay, they're a poet, but they also work in this other area. He's a fiction writer, but he also does essays. This is also something that I think is really interesting about the contemporary crop of young West Virginia writers, is genre really doesn't know much of any bounds. Nima Avashia, really interesting. This is another one. Her family came from India to Charleston for her father's work in industry. And Nima, I think, is in Boston now, but has written a really, really wonderful memoir about her family's time in West Virginia. Now, she was in here in West Virginia for a short period of time. To my mind, she wrote a book about her deeply West Virginian experience. That is somebody that we can call a West Virginia writer. That's somebody I would call a West Virginia writer. Not that everything has to be about West Virginia, but she's dealt with it. She's grappled with it. Ann Pancake down here is really, as strange as this weather has been, me and Daddy listen to Bob Marley. There's a number of books that Ann has done that really delve deeply into her West Virginia history and experience. Again, for every one of these names, there are many that I'm not telling you about. But these are some, as the active crop, I mean, just look at the range of people and backgrounds and histories and types of writing that we have here. West Virginia writing today is characterized by a really, really interesting diversity of viewpoint and background and styles. And we're going to be hearing from a lot of them later on. I'll freeze this here when the video goes up. You can freeze this here on the YouTube video and get some of these names here. But these are just the ones whose work that I know the best in prose and poetry, that I've read more than one thing by. And so you've got here at the bottom, and many more, both in prose and in poetry. There are a couple of names here that I might point out in particular. Under poetry, Rachel Hicks was a wonderful young poet, died way too soon, just ahead of her 37th birthday. But I will always feel terrible that we're not going to have any more books by Rachel Hicks. She's a really fantastic writer. Bill King, 3 up from the bottom, is another one, passed way too young. But we are very fortunate to have books by all of these folks published in the last 25 years. And as I was saying, before the lecture, we were talking a little bit. I think all of the people that I'm talking about here, with one or two exceptions, their first books were published after the year 2000. I mean, this is really a hell of a period of expansion and growth for West Virginia writing. You can see it all kind of blowing up. One of the reasons for this, I think maybe the preponderance, this is just a theory, but I think one of the reasons for this may be that we've kind of returned in literary fiction and poetry to a sort of a decentralized publishing model. Small presses, micro presses, presses that are focused on Appalachian writing, some presses that are focused on West Virginia writing. And so there are more routes now to the public view than there used to be. It's always a challenge to begin listing names out. I happen to be married to a poet too. Jessica Spruill, who is my wife, is also a working poet. So there's one of the things that we always try and do is keep each other up on what's happening and who's going to. Jessica herself actually edits currently 2 literary journals. So, you write poetry, but also fiction. You edit a couple of journals, you publish poetry. These are working writers. These are people who produce and are putting it out. How many poets? Well, I'm very happy to say that during the pandemic, during the first days of the pandemic, when nobody knew if we were going to be able to gather or where we were going to be able to gather, we at the council put out a call to West Virginia poets that we knew. And we had them in their homes read their own poetry and film it on their iPhones and send it in to us. That series went up on our social media pages. You can still find it on Facebook under the title Poetry During a Time of Crisis, West Virginia Poets on Community Resilience and Power of the Arts. And so a lot of folks read for us. Doug read for us, Crystal read for us, Torley read for us, Mark Harshman read for us. The response we got to that call was just amazing. And you see, again, that idea of people coming together, I think, in West Virginia culture, true of its writers, no less so than its residents generally. Last plug. EWV, as I said, has a lot of resources on West Virginia literature, but it's been tough to keep up. We're going to be working to expand this section in particular in the upcoming year to honor all of this fantastic work that's being done by West Virginia writers. I haven't done a lot of reading or like sample reading from West Virginia writers and poets during this session because you're going to hear a lot of that later on in the series. But any of the names that we have discussed today, I can recommend to you wholeheartedly. It's again, not every writer is for everybody, right? Only good writing is, for regular folks. Was it Roger Ebert said, like all movies, he was talking about a particular movie. He said, like all great movies, it's not for everybody. Only bad movies are for everybody. So that's kind of how you feel about West Virginia. So, yeah, but in that list, you're going to find something that you like. And all of these writers, like I said, with a couple of exceptions, are still working. They're still with us. They're still producing good material. Academia tends to be about, I would say, 5 or 10 years behind the times. It takes a little while for writers to enter the classroom, in terms of what gets taught and what gets passed around. But there is a huge, huge and vibrant culture all across the state of West Virginia writers who are really documenting what it means to be here now, what this space looks and feels like as we enter the 21st century. It is really, as I said, this is a hill that I will die on. I think it is the most diverse and the most productive time of West Virginia literature to date. It's really remarkable, the kind of work that is being done. And that is what I have. Thank you all for hanging with it. There was a lot to talk about. But thank you all for showing up. Woo! I don't know. They're about China. There is a lot of, she's got to be in the room when you talk about West Virginia writing. She's indeed the first Pulitzer winner that we ever produced. So you've got to be there. But as far as the content that Pearl Buck produced, I would say she's more significant as a West Virginia writer who was born in West Virginia, who emerged on the national stage. I would say historically, that's probably what's most meaningful about Pearl Buck. And the content really is not necessarily germane to West Virginia. But I think in terms of visibility and popularity and critical acclaim, she's probably 0.0 for West Virginia writers. If you look at it on the page, I don't think it may not make sense, but I see a lot of Breeze Pancake's very clear-eyed depiction of sort of economic conditions and hardship. The characters in Breeze Pancake often fight. They drink a little more than they should. They go out and they get into trouble. I see a lot of that in Scott McClanahan. I think there is a real kind of connection to that particular kind of lived experience in Scott McClanahan's work. If you're looking for a place to start with McClanahan, the Sarah book is the title of one of his more recent ones. And it's just really, that's a phenomenal novel, just knockout from top to bottom. Language gets a little salty. The dramatic situations get a little rough sometimes, but it's well worth checking out. There's no question that the same impulse that drives the storytelling in literary fiction has driven West Virginia music and musicians and storytellers, folk storytellers through the years. I mean, we are, if we are anything, we are a storytelling people, I think. And no less so in the music than in the literature. You're absolutely right. And a motley crew there, too. I mean, Hazel Dickens, absolutely. Hazel Adkins is another. I mean, the wild man of Boone County. There's a long tradition of, I love that story about that. I think it's Doug Van Gundy tells about when he had moved away from West Virginia and he heard on the radio West Virginia, My Home by Hazel Dickens. And he was in Utah or some place. I mean, he was way out in the West. And he said he heard that and just broke down into tears because it was that connection with, being back home. And, he was at school like I was and really not, I mean, when you do that, you're not really certain whether or not you're going to be able to get back. If you're a teacher, you kind of just go where the jobs are. But that connection to home was something that he and I both had stories that were very, very similar in that regard. Sometimes all it takes is a, snatch music on the radio to bring you back. It seems to be memoir. I think this is right. It seems to be memoir in either short or long form that West Virginia writers are most drawn to. I mentioned John's book, No Son of Mine, which is a really, really wonderful piece of work. but also essays by West Virginia writers on what it means to be here and, what things are like, what are certain conditions that obtain. The pieces that are always the most interesting to me are not the journalistic pieces where people come in from outside and write about it, but somebody from within that community who writes about that experience is certainly something we have no shortage of. Thank you all so much for coming out. Happy Sunday. Thank you.